while her college classmates wore designer jewelry and sorority pins. Maya Chun wore a pair of tarnished dog tags that looked like they'd been bought from a military surplus store. They called them fake costume jewelry. They were about to discover why some pieces of metal carry the weight of history. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Riverside University Student Union, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors where dozens of students gathered for the annual Veterans Appreciation Day Planning Committee meeting. Maya Chun sat quietly in the back row, her fingers unconsciously running along the chain around her neck, feeling the familiar weight of the two rectangular pieces of metal that had become as much a part of her as breathing. The committee room buzzed with the energy of privileged college students who approached volunteer work with the same enthusiasm they brought to planning spring break trips. Designer handbags sat perched on mahogany chairs, smartphones with the latest cases glinted in the morning light, and conversations flowed between discussions of weekend parties and internships at Daddy's law firm. "All right, everyone, let's get started," announced Brittany Westfield, the committee chairwoman whose father owned half the commercial real estate in the city. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and her outfit probably cost more than most students' monthly rent. As you all know, Veterans Day is approaching, and this university has a reputation to maintain when it comes to our appreciation events. Maya shifted in her seat, the metal tags clinking softly against each other. The sound was barely audible, but to her, it was as familiar as her own heartbeat. She'd been wearing them for 3 years now, ever since her 18th birthday, when her grandmother had pressed them into her hands with tears in her eyes and stories that were too painful to tell in full. "We need to make sure this year's event is absolutely perfect," Brittany continued, consulting her tablet with the seriousness of a Fortune 500 CEO. "The mayor will be attending, along with several city council members and major donors to the university. This isn't just about honoring veterans. It's about showcasing our institution's commitment to patriotic values." Several hands shot up around the room. Madison Cooper, whose family's name graced the business school building, was the first to speak. "I think we should focus on aesthetics. This year, maybe a red, white, and blue theme with professional photography. Something that would look amazing on the university's social media accounts." "Excellent point," Brittany nodded approvingly. "We want something that's both respectful and visually stunning. After all, if it doesn't look good online, did it really happen?" A few students chuckled at this, and Maya felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. These were the same students who posted carefully curated photos of their volunteer work at homeless shelters, making sure their manicures were visible as they ladled soup into bowls. Their commitment to causes extended exactly as far as their Instagram feeds. Tyler Morrison, the quarterback whose athletic scholarship was the only thing keeping him academically eligible, raised his hand. "What about getting some actual veterans to speak? You know, for authenticity. My dad knows a guy who was in Iraq. He's got some crazy stories." "That's definitely something to consider," Brittany replied, making a note on her tablet. "Though, we'll need to screen them carefully. We want inspiring stories, not anything too heavy or traumatic. This is supposed to be a celebration, not a therapy session." Maya's fingers tightened around the dog tags. She thought about her grandmother's stories, the ones that came in fragments during late-night conversations when the old woman's guard was down. Stories about a young soldier who never came home, about letters that stopped arriving, about a flag folded into a perfect triangle and presented to a 19-year-old wife who was already carrying a child she would raise alone. "What about decorations?" asked Jennifer Walsh, whose mother ran the most exclusive country club in 3 counties. "I'm thinking we could do a really sophisticated military theme. Maybe some prop uniforms, fake medals, that sort of thing. Very tasteful, of course." "Love it," Brittany said, her eyes lighting up. "We could even set up photo booths where people can pose with military props. Imagine how great that would look for the university's promotional materials." The conversation continued in this vein, with students suggesting increasingly elaborate ways to package patriotism into an aesthetically pleasing event that would photograph well and impress the right people. Maya listened with growing discomfort as they discussed veterans as if they were abstract concepts rather than real people with real experiences. "Oh, and we definitely need to be careful about the guest list," Madison added, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I mean, we want real veterans, but we also want people who fit the image we're trying to project. Clean-cut, articulate, preferably photogenic. Nothing against anyone else, but this is about the university's reputation." Maya felt heat rising in her cheeks. She thought about the homeless veteran she'd seen outside the campus coffee shop last week, the one with the cardboard sign and the haunted eyes that reminded her so much of the photographs her grandmother kept hidden in an old shoebox. She thought about her grandmother's stories of coming home to a country that didn't want to acknowledge the war they'd fought, let alone the women who'd served in it. "Excuse me," Maya said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the room. Brittany looked up from her tablet with mild annoyance. "Yes? I was wondering if we've considered actually consulting with veterans about what they might want from an appreciation event. Maybe asking them what would be meaningful rather than just assuming what would look good." The room fell silent for a moment. Several students exchanged glances, and Maya could practically hear them thinking the same thing. Who was this girl who clearly didn't understand how these things worked? "That's sweet," Brittany said with the kind of patronizing smile usually reserved for small children and elderly relatives. "But we have professionals handling the planning. This needs to be executed at a certain level, you understand. We can't just wing it." "I understand," Maya replied, her voice still quiet but carrying a note of steel that made a few students look at her more carefully. "I just think that if we're claiming to honor veterans, we should probably make sure we're doing it in a way that actually honors them, not just ourselves." Jennifer Walsh let out a small laugh. "That's very noble, but let's be realistic here. Most of us don't exactly have military connections. We're doing our best with what we know." Maya's hand moved to her dog tags again, and this time the motion caught Jennifer's attention. The other girl's eyes focused on the chain around Maya's neck, and her expression shifted to one of amused disdain. "Oh my God, are those supposed to be real dog tags?" Jennifer asked, her voice carrying just loud enough for the surrounding students to hear. "That's so cute. Where did you get them? A costume shop?" Several heads turned toward Maya, and she felt the familiar weight of being examined and found wanting. She'd experienced this before, the way wealthy students looked at her second-hand clothes, her ancient laptop, her scholarship student lifestyle. But this felt different. This felt personal. "They're not fake," Maya said simply. "Come on," Madison joined in, apparently finding the subject amusing. "They look like they've been through a war zone. If they were real, wouldn't they be in better condition?" The irony of the comment wasn't lost on Maya, but she didn't respond immediately. She thought about trying to explain, about telling them the story her grandmother had finally shared on her deathbed just 6 months ago. About a young woman who'd lied about her age to join the Army Nurse Corps in 1969, who'd spent 13 months in a MASH unit outside Da Nang, who'd come home to a country that didn't acknowledge that women had served in combat roles, and a family that was ashamed of what she'd done. But looking around the room at these faces, these students who treated serious subjects like Instagram opportunities, Maya realized that her grandmother's story wasn't for them. It wasn't entertainment or a conversation starter or a way to add authenticity to their carefully planned event. "They're real," she repeated, her voice steady. Tyler Morrison leaned forward in his chair, apparently enjoying the drama. "Real, like actually issued by the military? Come on, what are you, 19? When were you in the service? I never said they were mine. Oh, so they're like your boyfriends or something? Jennifer asked with a smirk. That's even more pathetic. Wearing someone else's tags to look cool. Maya felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd faced skepticism before about various aspects of her life, her academic achievements, her work-study jobs, her presence in spaces where wealth was the assumed norm. But this was different. This was about the one thing she carried that connected her to something larger than herself, something that had nothing to do with money or status or the arbitrary social hierarchies of college life. Look, Brittany interjected, clearly wanting to move the meeting along. This is all very interesting, but we have actual planning to do. Maya, if you want to contribute meaningfully to this committee, maybe focus on practical suggestions rather than whatever this is. The dismissal was clear, and Maya felt the familiar sting of being reduced to irrelevance by people who'd never had to fight for anything in their lives. But as she sat there, feeling the weight of the dog tags against her chest, she also felt something else. A responsibility that went beyond her own comfort or social standing. The serial numbers, she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the resumed chatter about color schemes and catering options. What? Brittany asked impatiently. The serial numbers on dog tags. They're unique identifiers tied to specific service records. If these were fake, the numbers would either be random or copied from somewhere else. But these numbers ... Maya paused, pulling the tags out from under her shirt for the first time in public. These numbers tell a very specific story. The room had grown quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Several students were actually looking at the tags now, noting details they'd missed during their casual mockery. The metal was indeed worn, but it was worn in a way that suggested decades of careful handling rather than rough treatment. The stamping was deep and precise, clearly done by military equipment rather than a novelty machine. Oroas Yen B. Yargi. Patricia A., Maya read from one of the tags. Blood type O positive. Serial number A18,654,321. The RAA designation indicates regular army, enlisted between 1950 and 1969. She turned the tag over, revealing the additional information stamped on the reverse side. Dob May 15, 1950. Religion, Jewish. Next of kin, Chun. Margaret Rose, Oakland, California. The last detail hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret Rose Chun, Maya's grandmother, whose maiden name had been Rosenberg until she married Maya's grandfather after the war. A woman who'd spent 50 years hiding her military service, partly because of the stigma attached to women in combat roles, and partly because of the way the country had treated Vietnam veterans when they came home. Chun, Madison repeated, her voice uncertain for the first time since the meeting began. Like your grandmother? Maya nodded slowly. Like my grandmother, who spent 13 months in Vietnam as an army nurse, who saved lives while people her age were protesting the war she was fighting, who came home to a country that didn't want to hear about what she'd done or what she'd seen. The room was completely silent now. Several students were looking uncomfortable, apparently realizing that their casual mockery had veered into territory they weren't prepared to navigate. But Maya wasn't finished. She never talked about it, Maya continued, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of controlled emotion. Not for 50 years. Not until she was dying and wanted to make sure someone remembered. She gave me these tags and told me stories that she'd never told anyone else. About friends who didn't come home. About holding dying soldiers while mortar fell around the hospital. About being spit on at the San Francisco airport when she finally made it back to American soil. Brittany's perfect composure was beginning to crack. Maya, we didn't know. No, you didn't know, Maya agreed. Because you didn't ask. You saw something that didn't fit your assumptions, and decided it must be fake. Just like you're planning an event to honor veterans without bothering to ask any veterans what would actually honor them. The accusation hung in the air, and Maya could see several students shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Tyler Morrison, who'd been so quick to question the authenticity of her tags, was now studying his hands with intense concentration. Jennifer Walsh had gone pale, apparently realizing that her costume shop comment had been more cruel than clever. Maya stood up, slowly tucking the dog tags back under her shirt. "I'll leave you to your planning," she said quietly. "I'm sure you'll come up with something very photogenic." As she walked toward the door, she could hear whispered conversation starting behind her. Someone muttered something about feeling terrible, and another voice suggested maybe they should reconsider their approach. But Maya didn't look back. She'd said what needed to be said, and now she needed to get out of this room full of people who treated her grandmother's sacrifice like a prop in their social media performance. The hallway outside the meeting room was empty and quiet, a stark contrast to the buzzing energy she'd left behind. Maya walked slowly toward the main entrance of the student union, her mind filled with images from her grandmother's stories. Patricia Rosenberg, 19 years old and fierce with determination, lying about her age to join an army that didn't want women in combat zones, working 18-hour shifts in conditions that would have broken stronger people, coming home to a country that was ashamed of the war she'd fought and a society that couldn't reconcile her gender with her service. Maya pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the crisp autumn air. The campus was busy with the usual mid-morning activity, students hurrying between classes, faculty members walking with purposeful strides, maintenance workers tending to the immaculate landscaping that helped justify the university's exorbitant tuition fees. She found herself walking toward the small memorial garden that most students ignored, a quiet space tucked between the library and the science building where a simple stone monument listed the names of alumni who died in military service. Maya had discovered it during her freshman year, drawn by its peaceful atmosphere and the way it seemed separate from the competitive energy that dominated the rest of campus. The monument was older than she'd initially realized, with names dating back to World War I. Some were carved in the original stone, while others had been added over the decades as new conflicts claimed new lives. Maya had spent hours here during her grandmother's final illness, reading the names and wondering about the stories behind them. How many had families who kept their service secret? How many had come home to find that their sacrifices were inconvenient truths in a society that preferred its heroes sanitized and simplified? As she sat on the small bench facing the monument, Maya thought about the meeting she'd just left. Part of her regretted speaking up, knowing that she'd probably made enemies of people who could make her remaining college years more difficult. Brittany Westfield's family had influence throughout the city, and Jennifer Walsh's mother sat on the board of several organizations that offered internships and scholarships, but a larger part of her felt something she hadn't experienced in months. A sense of connection to her grandmother that went beyond grief and loss. Patricia Rosenberg had faced down much worse than a room full of privileged college students. She'd stood her ground in situations where the stakes were literally life and death. The least Maya could do was honor that legacy by refusing to let her grandmother's service be dismissed or trivialized. The dog tags felt warm against her skin, heated by her body temperature and the emotional intensity of the morning. Maya pulled them out and held them in her palm, studying the worn metal and precise stamping that told such a small part of such a large story. These weren't just pieces of metal. They were tangible links to a history that was still being written, still being remembered, still being honored by people who understood the weight of service and sacrifice. She thought about her grandmother's final words, whispered in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and approaching death. "Don't let them make it pretty, Maya. Don't let them turn it into something easy to swallow. The truth isn't always comfortable, but it's the only thing that matters. At the time, Maya had thought her grandmother was talking about her own death, about the family's tendency to avoid difficult conversations about illness and mortality. But now, sitting in this quiet garden with the weight of authentic military history in her hands, she understood that the old woman had been talking about something much larger. She'd been talking about the responsibility that comes with carrying someone else's truth. Maya closed her fist around the dog tags and made a decision that would change everything. She was going to make sure Patricia Rosenberg's story was told. Not as inspiration porn for a university's public relations campaign, but as the complex, difficult, important truth it actually was. She was going to find a way to honor her grandmother's service that didn't require making it palatable for people who'd never faced a day of real hardship in their lives. The morning sun was climbing higher, and Maya could hear the distant sound of construction from the new dormitory being built with money donated by families like Brittany's and Jennifer's. Everything on this campus was designed to be impressive, to project an image of success and tradition that would justify the astronomical cost of attendance. But real tradition, Maya was beginning to understand, wasn't about marble facades and manicured lawns. It was about carrying forward the stories that mattered, even when they were uncomfortable, even when they challenged people's assumptions about who got to be heroes and what heroism actually looked like. She stood up from the bench and walked back toward the academic buildings, the dog tags tucked safely under her shirt, but their presence more tangible than ever. She had classes to attend and assignments to complete, but she also had something else now, a mission that went beyond her own education and career prospects. Maya Chun was going to make sure that Patricia Rosenberg was remembered properly, and she was going to start by refusing to let anyone else dismiss her grandmother's service as fake or unimportant. The privileged students on the Veterans Appreciation Day committee had made their assumptions based on their own limited understanding of what military service looked like. They were about to learn that their assumptions were not only wrong, but dangerously naive. The real story was just beginning. The news of Maya's confrontation with the Veterans Day Committee spread through the campus social network with the speed and distortion typical of college gossip. By the time she arrived at her afternoon political science seminar, whispered conversations died abruptly as she entered the classroom, replaced by the kind of pointed silence that made clear she was the subject being discussed. Professor Williams was already arranging his materials at the front of the lecture hall, but Maya could feel the weight of 24 pairs of eyes following her as she made her way to her usual seat in the middle section. She'd learned early in her college career that sitting too close to the front marked you as overeager, while sitting too far back suggested disengagement. The middle rows were neutral territory, or at least they had been until today. "Isn't that the girl with the fake dog tags?" Someone whispered behind her, the words carrying just far enough to ensure Maya would hear them. "I heard she completely freaked out on Brittany Westfield," came another voice. "Like totally lost it over some costume jewelry." Maya kept her expression neutral and pulled out her notebook, but her fingers instinctively moved to the chain around her neck. The dog tags were hidden beneath her sweater, but their presence felt more obvious than ever, as if everyone in the room could see through the fabric to the worn metal beneath. "She was probably just embarrassed about being called out," said Jessica Porter, whose voice Maya recognized without turning around. Jessica was one of Jennifer Walsh's closest friends, someone who'd inherited both wealth and the casual cruelty that often came with it. "I mean, wearing military stuff when you've never served. That's stolen valor, isn't it?" The accusation hit Maya like a physical blow. Stolen valor, the crime of falsely claiming military service or decorations. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated character assassination she should have expected from this crowd. The type of people who could destroy reputations with carefully chosen words in social media campaigns. "Actually," said a new voice, one that made Maya turn around in surprise. Stolen valor specifically refers to falsely claiming to have earned military decorations or benefits. Wearing inherited military items isn't illegal or unethical. The speaker was David Kim, a senior Maya knew only by reputation. He was quiet, serious, and rumored to be heading to law school at Harvard in the fall. More importantly, he was someone whose family background gave him social credibility that Maya's scholarship student status couldn't match. "How would you know?" Jessica challenged, clearly annoyed at having her narrative disrupted. "Because my grandfather was a Marine in Korea," David replied calmly. "And because I actually looked up the legal definition before making accusations." The exchange created a brief moment of uncomfortable silence, during which Professor Williams called the class to order. But Maya could feel the tension continuing to simmer around her as the lecture began. She tried to focus on the discussion of foreign policy doctrine, but her mind kept drifting to the conversation happening in whispers around her. After class, Maya packed her materials quickly, hoping to avoid further confrontation. But as she made her way toward the exit, she found David Kim waiting near the door. "Walk with me?" he asked quietly. Maya nodded, grateful for what felt like the first friendly gesture she'd received all day. They made their way out of the building and across the quad, where the afternoon sun was casting long shadows between the neo-Gothic buildings that made the campus look like a movie set designed to represent academic prestige. "That was brave. What you did this morning," David said as they walked. "Stupid maybe, but brave." "Thanks, I think," Maya replied with a weak smile. "Brittany Westfield and her crew aren't people you want as enemies," David continued. "Their families basically run this town. Cross them, and you'll find yourself uninvited from study groups, excluded from social events, maybe even passed over for research positions and internships." Maya had already figured this out, but hearing it stated so bluntly made her stomach tighten. "So you think I should apologize? Pretend my grandmother's service doesn't matter to keep peace with people who think veterans are photo props?" "I think you should be smart about how you fight this battle," David said. "Because make no mistake, you're in a battle now. The question is whether you're going to fight it on their terms or your own." They stopped near the student center, where small groups of students were gathered on benches and grassy areas, enjoying the unseasonably warm October afternoon. Maya noticed how many of them looked in her direction, some with curiosity, others with the kind of predatory interest that suggested they were hoping for drama. "What do you mean?" Maya asked. "They're going to try to control the narrative," David explained. "Make this about you seeking attention, or lying about your family history, or being unstable. They're good at that kind of thing. But they're not prepared for someone who actually knows what they're talking about." Maya studied his face, trying to understand what he was suggesting. "You think I should double down?" "I think you should tell the truth. The whole truth. Make them deal with the real story instead of the sanitized version they prefer." Before Maya could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of several students she recognized from the morning's committee meeting. Tyler Morrison led the group, his athletic confidence making the encounter feel more like intimidation than conversation. "Hey Maya," Tyler said, his tone carrying false friendliness that didn't reach his eyes. "We wanted to clear the air about this morning. I think there might have been some misunderstandings." Maya glanced at David, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "What kind of misunderstandings?" "Well, nobody meant to question your family service," said Madison Cooper, who'd apparently been elected spokesperson for the group. "We were just surprised, you know. It's not like you ever mentioned it before." The implication was clear. If Maya's military connection was real, why hadn't she advertised it? Why hadn't she used it for social capital the way these students used their family's wealth and connections? "I don't generally discuss my grandmother's military service with people I barely know," Maya replied evenly. "Right, of course," Madison continued. It's just that, well, some people are saying you might have misunderstood what we were talking about this morning. Like, maybe you took things too personally? Maya felt her temper beginning to rise. They were trying to gaslight her, to make her question her own perceptions and reactions. It was a sophisticated form of bullying, designed to make the victim doubt themselves, while allowing the aggressors to maintain plausible deniability. I understood perfectly, Maya said. You were planning an event to honor veterans without consulting any veterans, and when I suggested that might be problematic, several of you decided to mock my grandmother's dog tags as fake costume jewelry. That's not exactly how it happened, Tyler interjected. I mean, you have to admit, it looked suspicious. A teenager wearing military tags? Come on. You know it looks suspicious to me. David Kim said suddenly, his voice carrying an edge. That made the group turn toward him. A bunch of rich kids planning a veterans event like it's a themed party, then attacking someone who actually has military family when she points out the problem. The group's dynamic shifted immediately. David's family wealth matched their own, which meant his criticism carried weight in a way Maya's never could. More importantly, his calm, lawyerly delivery made their defensive responses sound shrill and unconvincing. We weren't attacking anyone, Madison protested. We were just asking questions. You accused her of stolen valor and suggested she bought her grandmother's dog tags at a costume shop, David replied matter-of-factly. That sounds like attacking to me. Tyler's face flushed red. Look, we don't need some lecture from you about what? About treating veterans' families with respect? About not turning military service into Instagram content? David's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. Yeah, I think you do need that lecture. The confrontation was drawing attention from other students, and Maya could see phones being pulled out to record what was clearly becoming a more serious conflict. She thought about her grandmother's stories of facing down military bureaucracy and hostile crowds at anti-war protests, and made a decision. You want to know about Patricia Rosenberg? Maya said, her voice carrying across the gathering crowd. She was 19 when she lied about her age to join the Army Nurse Corps in 1969. She spent 13 months at a MASH unit outside Da Nang, working 18-hour shifts while mortar fell around the hospital. The phones were definitely recording now, and Maya could see more students gathering to listen. But instead of feeling exposed, she felt something else, a sense of purpose that connected her to her grandmother's courage. She came home to protesters spitting on her at the San Francisco airport, Maya continued. To a country that didn't want to acknowledge that women had served in combat roles. To a society that was ashamed of the war she'd fought and the lives she'd saved. Madison Cooper looked increasingly uncomfortable. Maya, maybe we should. She spent 50 years hiding her service, Maya pressed on. 50 years pretending that the most important thing she'd ever done didn't matter. Because people like you decided that veterans should only exist when they're convenient for your narrative. The crowd was growing larger, and Maya could see some faculty members beginning to take notice. But she was committed now, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Don't let them make it pretty. Don't let them turn it into something easy to swallow. These dog tags aren't costume jewelry, Maya said, pulling them out from under her sweater for the second time that day. They're the only physical proof that Patricia Rosenberg existed, that she served, that she mattered. Because the military didn't keep good records of women in combat roles, and the VA didn't acknowledge her service for decades after she came home. Tyler Morrison was clearly getting angry. This is ridiculous. You're making a scene over nothing. Over nothing? Maya's voice rose slightly, and she felt the familiar weight of righteous anger that her grandmother must have carried for decades. My grandmother's service is nothing. The sacrifice of women who weren't officially supposed to be in combat zones is nothing. That's not what he meant, Madison said quickly, apparently recognizing that they were losing control of the situation. That's exactly what he meant, David Kim interjected. It's what all of you meant this morning when you dismissed her as fake. You can't handle the reality of military service, so you prefer the sanitized version that looks good in photos. The crowd was definitely on Maya's side now. She could see nods of agreement and hear murmurs of support from students who were learning about Patricia Rosenberg's story for the first time. More importantly, she could see several people in the crowd who looked like they might have their own military connections, their own family stories that had been dismissed or ignored. Look, Brittany Westfield's voice cut through the growing conversation as she approached the group. Maya hadn't seen her arrive, but she should have expected it. Brittany's social media monitoring was legendary, and a viral confrontation involving her Veterans Day committee would have triggered immediate alerts. I think we all need to take a step back here, Brittany said, her public relations training evident in her carefully modulated tone. This has gotten way out of hand, and I'm sure nobody wants to say anything they'll regret. Maya looked at Brittany's perfectly composed face and felt something crystallize in her mind. This was exactly what her grandmother had warned her about. The attempt to make difficult truths comfortable, to sand down the sharp edges of reality until they couldn't cut through anyone's misconceptions. You're right, Maya said quietly. I don't want to say anything I'll regret. Brittany looked relieved, apparently thinking she'd successfully de-escalated the situation. But I also don't want to stay silent about something that matters more than your committee's reputation or my social standing on this campus, Maya continued. My grandmother spent 50 years being silent about her service. I'm not going to continue that tradition. The declaration hung in the air like a challenge, and Maya could see the calculation happening behind Brittany's eyes. This wasn't going to be resolved with smooth public relations tactics and social pressure. Maya had just made it clear that she was willing to sacrifice her own comfort for the principle at stake. Fine, Brittany said, her mask of diplomatic concern slipping slightly. But don't expect the committee to accommodate your personal drama. We have an event to plan, and we can't let individual grievances derail the entire project. Then plan it, Maya replied. But plan it honestly. Stop pretending you're honoring veterans when you're really just using them as props for your own image management. With that, Maya turned and walked away from the crowd, David Kim falling into step beside her. Behind them, she could hear animated conversations breaking out as students processed what they'd just witnessed. Some voices sounded supportive, others critical, but all of them were engaged with questions they'd probably never considered before. As they reached the edge of the quad, David glanced back at the dispersing crowd. Well, that's definitely going to be all over social media within the hour. Good, Maya said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Maybe it's time. This campus had a real conversation about what honoring veterans actually means. You realize they're going to come after you harder now, right? Brittany Westfield doesn't like being publicly challenged. Maya nodded, thinking about her grandmother facing down military bureaucrats and anti-war protesters with equal determination. I'm sure my grandmother faced worse opposition than a college socialite with daddy issues. David laughed, the first genuine moment of humor in what had been a very serious day. Fair point. But she probably didn't have to worry about her reputation on Rate My Professor or getting blackballed from campus organizations. No, Maya agreed. She just had to worry about mortar rounds and dying soldiers and coming home to a country that didn't want to hear about what she'd done. They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the implications of what had just happened. Maya knew that crossing Brittany Westfield and her social circle would have consequences, but she also knew that backing down now would mean betraying everything her grandmother had taught her about standing up for what mattered. As they approached the library, Maya's phone buzzed with notifications. Social media mentions, text messages from classmates, and missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The confrontation was already spreading beyond the campus, picked up by local news outlets and military support groups who'd been alerted. By students in the crowd. Ready for this? David asked, nodding toward her buzzing phone. Maya thought about Patricia Rosenberg, 19 years old and determined to serve her country despite a military establishment that didn't want women in combat zones. She thought about her grandmother coming home to a society that treated her service as an embarrassment rather than a source of pride. "I better be," Maya said, tucking the dog tags back under her sweater, but keeping one hand pressed against them. Through the fabric. "Because I don't think there's any going back now." The real battle was just beginning, and Maya was starting to understand that it had never been about a Veterans Day planning committee or college social politics. It had always been about whose stories got told, whose service got acknowledged, and whose sacrifices were deemed worthy of respect. Patricia Rosenberg's granddaughter was about to make sure those questions got answered properly, regardless of the personal cost. By Thursday morning, Maya's confrontation with the Veterans Day committee had evolved from campus gossip into something much larger. The video footage captured by students had been shared across multiple social media platforms, attracting attention from veteran advocacy groups, military history enthusiasts, and local news outlets hungry for a story that combined campus controversy with patriotic themes. Maya discovered the extent of the coverage when she arrived at her morning American history seminar to find Professor Elizabeth Hartwell waiting with a stack of printed articles and a tablet displaying various social media posts. The older woman had served as a Navy intelligence officer before pursuing her academic career, and her classes were among the few at Riverside University that attracted students genuinely interested in learning rather than simply fulfilling requirements. "Miss Chun," Professor Hartwell said as Maya took her usual seat, "I believe we need to discuss yesterday's events." The classroom was buzzing with an energy Maya hadn't experienced since arriving at the university 3 years ago. Students who normally spent class time checking their phones or planning weekend activities were actually engaged, leaning forward in their seats and participating in animated discussions about military service, campus politics, and the responsibilities that came with inherited legacy. "I've been contacted by several journalists asking for my perspective on your grandmother's service record," Professor Hartwell continued. "Apparently, your confrontation has raised questions about how this university handles military history and veteran recognition." Maya felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She'd expected social consequences from challenging Brittany Westfield's crowd, but she hadn't anticipated that her personal family story would become a subject of academic and journalistic scrutiny. "What kind of questions?" Maya asked. "The productive kind," Professor Hartwell replied with a slight smile. "Questions about why Patricia Rosenberg's service wasn't documented in the university's Veterans Memorial, despite her obvious connection to the campus through your enrollment. Questions about how many other women veterans might have been overlooked in our institutional memory." Sarah Mitchell, a senior whose grandfather had served in World War II, raised her hand. "Professor, I looked up that serial number Maya mentioned yesterday. The ZRAA designation really does indicate regular Army enlisted personnel from that time. Period. The format matches exactly what the military was using in 1969, which raises interesting questions about authentication and verification," Professor Hartwell noted. "Miss Chun, have you considered submitting your grandmother's information to the Department of Veterans Affairs for official recognition?" Maya shook her head. "My grandmother never applied for VA benefits. She said the paperwork was too complicated, and she didn't want to relive everything by having to prove her service to bureaucrats who weren't there. That's unfortunately common among women veterans of that era," Professor Hartwell explained to the class. The military's record-keeping for female personnel in combat zones was inconsistent at best. Many women who served in support roles that involved exposure to combat situations weren't officially recognized as combat veterans until decades later. Michael Torres, whose brother was currently deployed in Afghanistan, leaned forward in his seat. So Maya's grandmother might have qualified for benefits she never received? Almost certainly, Professor Hartwell confirmed. The Agent Orange. Exposure alone would have qualified her for disability compensation, assuming she served in the areas where chemical defoliants were used. And given the location Maya mentioned, Da Nang, that exposure would have been virtually unavoidable. Maya felt something cold settle in her chest. Her grandmother had suffered from respiratory problems and skin conditions for decades, issues that the family had attributed to aging and environmental factors. The possibility that these health problems were connected to her military service, and that treatment might have been available through VA benefits, added another layer of tragedy to Patricia Rosenberg's story. This is exactly why proper documentation and recognition matter, Professor Hartwell said, addressing the entire class but clearly speaking to Maya specifically. It's not just about honoring service in the abstract. It's about ensuring that veterans receive the support and benefits they've earned. The discussion continued for the remainder of the class period, with students sharing their own family military stories and asking questions about the gaps in official records. Maya found herself becoming an inadvertent expert on her grandmother's service, fielding questions about dates, locations, and details she'd never expected to discuss in an academic setting. As the class ended, Professor Hartwell approached Maya with a proposal that would change everything. "I've been thinking about your situation," the professor said, "and I believe there's an opportunity here for something more significant than just resolving a campus controversy." Maya packed her materials slowly, unsure where this conversation was heading. "The university has a partnership with the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress," Professor Hartwell continued. "We document and preserve veteran testimonies for historical research. I'd like to propose that we create a formal oral history project centered on your grandmother's service." "But she's dead," Maya pointed out. "There's no testimony to record." "No, but there are her belongings, her medical records, possibly other documentation that hasn't been examined by military historians. More importantly, there are other women, veterans from that era who might be willing to share their stories if they see that someone is finally taking female military service seriously." The idea was both exciting and terrifying. Maya had spent 3 days defending her grandmother's memory against skeptics and mockers, but the prospect of subjecting Patricia Rosenberg's story to formal academic scrutiny felt like a much larger responsibility. "What would that involve?" Maya asked. "Research, documentation, interviews with other veterans who served in similar roles. We'd work with the VA to establish your grandmother's official service record, examine her medical history for service-connected conditions, and create a comprehensive archive that would serve as a resource for other researchers." Professor Hartwell paused, studying Maya's expression carefully. "It would also mean continuing to challenge the narrative that your classmates prefer, the sanitized version of military service that focuses on heroic moments and ignores the complex realities of war and homecoming." Maya thought about the confrontation on the quad, about Brittany Westfield's attempts to control the conversation, about Tyler Morrison's dismissive comments about her grandmother's dog tags. Then she thought about Patricia Rosenberg, 19 and determined, lying about her age to serve a country that would spend decades pretending she hadn't existed. "When would we start?" Maya asked. Professor Hartwell smiled. "How about right now? I've already received calls from 3 local news outlets and 2 military history organizations. The story is already out there, Maya. The question is whether you want to shape how it's told." 20 minutes later, Maya found herself in Professor Hartwell's office, surrounded by military history textbooks and facing a video camera operated by James Patterson, a journalism student who'd volunteered to document their preliminary interview. The setup was basic: a single camera, a digital recorder, and a table covered with documents Maya had retrieved from her grandmother's belongings. "Let's start with the basics," Professor Hartwell said, settling into her chair with the professional demeanor of someone accustomed to conducting interviews. "Tell me about Patricia Rosenberg's decision to enlist." Maya took a deep breath, thinking about the fragments of story her grandmother had shared during those final months. She was 18 when she first tried to enlist, but they rejected her because she was too young and didn't have parental consent. So she waited until she turned 19, forged a birth certificate to make herself look older, and tried again. Why was military service so important to her? Her older brother had been drafted and sent to Vietnam in 1968. He was killed in the Tet Offensive, and she felt like she had to finish what he'd started. But also, Maya paused, trying to find the right words for something her grandmother had struggled to explain. She said she felt like the war was happening whether she was part of it or not, and she'd rather be there helping people than sitting at home feeling helpless. Professor Hartwell made notes on a legal pad. What was her experience with military recruitment? Were they welcoming to female volunteers? Maya laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Not exactly. She said the recruiter kept trying to steer her toward clerical work or communications. When she insisted on medical training, he told her that women weren't psychologically suited for combat medicine. So she lied about her previous medical experience, claiming she'd worked as a nurse's aide in civilian hospitals. Had she? No, she'd been a waitress and a cashier. But she was smart, and she figured she could learn fast enough to avoid getting caught. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The interview continued for 2 hours, with Maya sharing details about her grandmother's training, deployment, and service that she'd never expected to discuss with strangers. But as she talked, she began to understand something important. These weren't just family stories anymore. They were historical documents that filled gaps in the official record of women's military service. James Patterson, the journalism student, asked questions that approached the story from a different angle. Maya, how did you feel when your classmates questioned the authenticity of your grandmother's dog tags? Angry, Maya replied immediately. But also sad, because I realized how many other stories like hers have probably been dismissed or forgotten because people don't want to deal with the complicated parts of military history. What do you mean by complicated parts? Maya thought about this carefully. I mean the parts that don't fit the narrative people prefer. Women in combat zones when they weren't supposed to be there. Veterans coming home to hostility instead of parades. People who served their country and then spent decades hiding that service because it was socially inconvenient. Professor Hartwell leaned forward. Do you think that's still happening today? I think it's happening right here on this campus, Maya said, her voice gaining strength. I think there are probably dozens of students with military family connections who don't talk about it because it doesn't fit with the image this university wants to project. And I think the Veterans Day Planning Committee is more interested in looking patriotic than actually understanding what military service involves. The camera continued rolling as Maya described her grandmother's homecoming experience, the decades of silence about her service, and the way Patricia Rosenberg's military identity had been subsumed by her roles as wife, mother, and grandmother. By the time they finished, Maya felt emotionally drained but also oddly relieved, as if she'd finally given voice to stories that had been waiting 50 years to be told. As James packed up his equipment, Professor Hartwell pulled out her phone and showed Maya the notifications that had been accumulating during their interview. 3 more news outlets want interviews, she said. The Veterans History Project coordinator from the Library of Congress wants to discuss expanding this into a regional study of women Vietnam veterans. And there's been interest from a documentary filmmaker who specializes in untold military stories. Maya stared at the phone screen, overwhelmed by the rapid escalation of what had started as a personal confrontation with her classmates. "I never intended for this to become so big," she said. "The most important stories usually don't start with grand intentions," Professor Hartwell replied. "They start with someone who's willing to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." Maya thought about her grandmother, 19, and lying about her age to join an army that didn't want her. She thought about Patricia Rosenberg coming home to a country that preferred to forget she'd existed. And she thought about the dog tags resting against her chest, the only proof that her grandmother's service had mattered. What happens next? Maya asked. Professor Hartwell smiled. "That depends on you. But I suspect your grandmother's story is about to reach a much larger audience than either of us imagined." Outside the office window, Maya could see students crossing the quad in the afternoon sunlight, most of them oblivious to the conversation that had just taken place. But among them, she noticed, were several individuals who looked older, more serious, carrying themselves with the distinctive bearing of people who'd served in uniform. The story was spreading, and Maya was beginning to understand that it was touching something much larger than a campus controversy or even her family's history. It was opening conversations about recognition, memory, and the price of service that had been waiting decades to be heard. The crisis arrived on Friday morning, in the form of a phone call from the university's Dean of Student Affairs. Maya was eating breakfast in her dorm room when her phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize, but which her caller ID identified as coming from the administration building. "Miss Chun, this is Dean Robertson. I need you to come to my office immediately. We have a situation that requires urgent attention." Maya's stomach dropped. She'd been expecting some form of administrative response to the growing media attention around her grandmother's story. But the dean's tone suggested something more serious than a routine meeting about campus publicity. "What kind of situation?" Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The kind that affects the university's reputation and our relationship with major donors. Please be in my office within the hour." The line went dead, leaving Maya staring at her phone and contemplating the rapid escalation of events that had begun with a simple Veterans Day planning meeting. She dressed quickly, choosing her most conservative outfit and making sure her grandmother's dog tags were securely hidden beneath her blouse. The walk across campus to the administration building felt like a march to execution. Students she passed seemed to look at her with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy, as if word had already spread about her impending meeting with the dean. Maya noticed several people pointing in her direction and whispering to their companions, confirming her suspicion that her confrontation with the Veterans Day Committee had become campus-wide. Entertainment. Dean Robertson's office occupied a corner of the administration building's top floor, with windows overlooking the manicured grounds that made Riverside University look like a country club with academic pretensions. The dean himself was a thin, nervous man in his 50s who'd spent his entire career in university administration, navigating the delicate balance between academic freedom and donor relations. Maya was surprised to find she wasn't alone in facing whatever crisis had prompted the urgent summons. Brittany Westfield sat in one of the leather chairs facing the dean's desk, her perfect composure intact, but her eyes carrying a hardness that suggested she was far from pleased about the current situation. "Miss Chun, please sit down," Dean Robertson said without preamble. "We need to discuss the events of this week and their impact on the university community." Maya took the remaining chair, acutely aware of the tension radiating from Brittany's direction. Whatever had happened, it was clear that the Veterans Day Committee chairwoman held Maya responsible for disrupting her carefully planned event. "I've been contacted by several concerned parties," Dean Robertson continued, consulting a folder thick with printed emails and documents. "Donors, alumni, community leaders, all expressing worry about the negative publicity surrounding our Veterans Day commemoration." "What negative publicity?" Maya asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. The media coverage of your allegations against the planning committee, Brittany interjected, her voice carrying barely controlled anger. Articles suggesting that the university doesn't properly honor veterans, that our commemoration events are somehow disrespectful or superficial. Dean Robertson held up a hand to forestall further comments from Brittany. Miss Westfield, please. Let me handle this discussion. He turned back to Maya, his expression carefully neutral but his underlying concern evident. Miss Chun, I understand you have strong feelings about your family's military history. However, your public statements have created complications that extend far beyond campus politics. Maya felt her temper beginning to rise. My public statements about my grandmother's service record? Your public statements questioning the integrity and motivations of student volunteers who are working to honor veterans, Dean Robertson corrected. Statements that have been interpreted by some as suggesting that the university itself doesn't properly respect military service. The dean opened his folder and pulled out several printed articles from local news websites. Maya could see headlines like University Student Claims Veterans Day Event Dishonors Service Members, and Campus Controversy Highlights Gaps in Military Recognition. This morning, I received a call from Harrison Westfield, Dean Robertson continued, and Maya understood immediately why Brittany was present for this meeting. Mr. Westfield expressed serious concern about the impact this controversy might have on the university's reputation, and specifically on the upcoming capital campaign. Harrison Westfield was Brittany's father and one of the university's largest donors. His real estate development company had funded the construction of 2 campus buildings and contributed millions to the endowment. Maya realized with growing clarity that she wasn't just facing academic discipline. She was threatening the financial foundation that kept Riverside University operating. Mr. Westfield has invested considerable resources in supporting this institution, Dean Robertson said carefully. He has every right to expect that his family's volunteer efforts on behalf of the university will be treated with appropriate respect. Maya looked at Brittany, who was watching the conversation with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully maneuvered an opponent into checkmate. This wasn't about Veterans Day planning or military recognition. It was about power, influence, and the unwritten rules that governed interactions between scholarship students and the wealthy families who funded their education. So what exactly are you asking me to do? Maya said, I'm asking you to consider the broader implications of your actions, Dean Robertson replied. The university values open dialogue and academic freedom, but we also have responsibilities to our donors, our community partners, and our institutional reputation. You want me to apologize, Maya said flatly. I want you to find a way to resolve this situation that allows everyone to move forward constructively, the dean said diplomatically. Brittany leaned forward in her chair. Maya, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here. Nobody ever questioned your grandmother's service or suggested that military veterans don't deserve respect. We were simply surprised by your reaction to what were intended as friendly questions. Maya stared at Brittany, amazed by the brazen rewriting of history. Friendly questions? You called my grandmother's dog tags fake costume jewelry and suggested I bought them at a military surplus store. I think you may have misinterpreted the tone of our conversation, Brittany replied smoothly. Sometimes when people are feeling defensive about personal issues, they can perceive criticism where none was intended. The gaslighting was masterful, designed to make Maya question her own memory and perception of events that had happened less than a week ago. But Maya had learned something important from her grandmother's stories about facing down military bureaucracy and social hostility. Sometimes the only way to fight institutional manipulation was with stubborn adherence to truth. Dean Robertson, Maya said, are you familiar with the concept of stolen valor? The dean looked confused by the apparent change of subject. I believe it refers to falsely claiming military honors or service. That's exactly right, Maya agreed. And yesterday, several members of the Veterans Day Planning Committee publicly accused me of stolen valor for wearing my grandmother's dog tags. That's not a misunderstanding or a friendly question. That's a serious legal accusation. Brittany's composure cracked slightly. That's not what happened. It's exactly what happened, and it was recorded by multiple students, Maya interrupted. Tyler Morrison specifically questioned whether I was falsely claiming military service. Jennifer Walsh suggested the tags were purchased at a costume shop. These weren't misunderstandings. They were deliberate attempts to humiliate me for challenging your planning approach. Dean Robertson was looking increasingly uncomfortable as he realized the legal implications of the situation. Accusations of stolen valor weren't just social conflicts. They involved federal law and could result in serious consequences for everyone involved. Furthermore, Maya continued, Professor Hartwell has confirmed that my grandmother's service record is authentic and that she likely qualified for VA benefits she never received due to inadequate record keeping for women veterans. So not only were the accusations false, they targeted someone whose military service was more extensive and more dangerous than most of the people this committee claims to honor. The room fell silent as the implications of Maya's statement sank in. Brittany was no longer looking confident, and Dean Robertson was clearly calculating the potential legal and public relations consequences of supporting accusations that had been proven false. Miss Chun, the dean said carefully, what would you consider an appropriate resolution to this situation? Maya thought about her grandmother's advice. Don't let them make it pretty. Don't let them turn it into something easy to swallow. The truth isn't always comfortable, but it's the only thing that matters. I want the Veterans Day Planning Committee to actually consult with veterans about what would constitute meaningful recognition, Maya said. I want the university to research how many other women veterans like my grandmother have been overlooked in our institutional memory. And I want a formal apology for the stolen valor accusations. Brittany's face flushed red. That's completely unreasonable. What's unreasonable, Maya cut her off, is a university that takes millions of dollars from donors while allowing their children to publicly humiliate students whose families actually sacrificed for this country. Dean Robertson held up both hands, clearly recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond his ability to manage with diplomatic language and institutional pressure. I think we need to take a step back here, he said. Miss Chun, your points about consultation and research are well taken. Miss Westfield, perhaps the committee could benefit from input from actual veterans about their preferences for recognition events. Maya could see Brittany calculating whether to accept this compromise or push for a more complete victory. But the presence of legal implications and documented evidence had shifted the balance of power in ways that money and family influence couldn't easily overcome. However, Dean Robertson continued, I also think it would be beneficial if all parties could find a way to move forward without further public controversy. The university's reputation affects everyone, students, faculty, staff, and the broader community we serve. Maya understood the implicit threat. She could have her partial victory, but only if she agreed to stop talking to reporters and drawing attention to the university's problems with donor influence and veteran recognition. I'll consider your suggestions, Maya said carefully. But I won't agree to hide my grandmother's story or pretend that the committee's approach was appropriate. As Maya left the dean's office, she realized that the crisis had revealed something important about the power dynamics that governed campus life. Money and influence could shape conversations and control narratives, but they couldn't change documented facts or silence people who were willing to accept the consequences of telling difficult truths. The real test would come when Maya had to decide whether partial institutional recognition was worth the price of silence, or whether her grandmother's legacy demanded something more substantial than diplomatic compromise. Outside the administration building, Maya pulled out her phone and saw 17 missed calls from journalists. 3 voicemails from veteran advocacy organizations, and a text message from Professor Hartwell. Ready for the next phase? The crisis was far from over, and Maya was beginning to understand that the stakes extended well beyond her personal conflict with Brittany Westfield and the university administration. The turning point came on Saturday morning when Maya discovered that someone had leaked the audio recording of her meeting with Dean Robertson to the campus newspaper. She was working in the library, trying to focus on her American history research paper, when her phone exploded with notifications from news outlets, social media platforms, and fellow students who'd seen the story spreading across the internet. Headline in the Riverside University Herald read, "Administration pressures student to silence. Veteran family story after donor complaint." Below, it was a detailed account of the dean's meeting, complete with quotes from the audio recording that made the university's priorities uncomfortably clear. The story had been picked up by regional news outlets within hours, and Maya could see from her trending notifications that it was rapidly gaining national attention. Maya's first instinct was panic. She'd expected her conflict with the Veterans Day Committee to remain a campus issue, possibly extending to local media coverage. But the revelation that the university administration had attempted to silence her at the behest of a major donor transformed the story into something much larger, a symbol of institutional corruption and the marginalization of veteran families. Phone rang, displaying a number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Maya hesitated, then answered, "Miss Chun? This is Sandra Martinez from the American Veterans Foundation. I'm calling about the situation at your university." Maya had heard of the American Veterans Foundation, a nonprofit organization that advocated for veteran rights and military family support. They were known for taking on high-profile cases involving veteran discrimination and institutional neglect. "We've been following the coverage of your grandmother's story," Sandra continued. "And frankly, we're appalled by what we're seeing. A university attempting to silence a veteran's granddaughter because her story inconveniences a major donor. This is exactly the kind of institutional bias that prevents proper recognition of military service." Maya found a quiet corner of the library and lowered her voice. "I never intended for this to become such a big issue. The biggest injustices often start with small acts of courage," Sandra replied. "Your willingness to stand up for your grandmothers memory has exposed problems that extend far beyond your campus. We'd like to help." "What kind of help?" "Legal representation, if necessary. Media coordination to ensure your story is told accurately. And most importantly, resources to help document your grandmother's service and connect with other families who faced similar situations." Maya felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. Professional support meant she wouldn't have to navigate this crisis alone, but it also meant acknowledging that there was no path back to the quiet campus life she'd known just a week ago. "There's something else you should know," Sandra continued. "We've been contacted by 12 other families just since yesterday. Veterans and veteran families who faced similar dismissal or denial of their service records. Your story has opened a floodgate." After ending the call, Maya sat in the library stacks, surrounded by books about American military history, and tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. Her personal family story had become a catalyst for something much larger, a reckoning with how society treated veteran families and military service that didn't fit convenient narratives. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Kim. "Check the campus forum. Brittany's fighting back." Maya opened the university's student discussion platform and immediately saw what David meant. Brittany Westfield had posted a lengthy statement defending the Veterans Day Planning Committee and portraying Maya as an attention-seeking troublemaker who deliberately misrepresented their interactions. "I want to address the false accusations that have been circulating about our Veterans Day Planning Committee," Brittany's post began. "Our team consists of dedicated student volunteers who have worked tirelessly to create a meaningful tribute to our nation's heroes. It's deeply unfair and hurtful to suggest that we don't respect military service or veteran families. The post went on to detail the committee's planning efforts, emphasizing their good intentions and volunteer commitment. But it was the final paragraphs that revealed Brittany's real strategy. While I sympathize with Maya Chun's desire to honor her family's military history, I'm concerned about the way this situation has been sensationalized and distorted. The recordings that were leaked to the media were taken without consent and edited to remove important context. This isn't about silencing anyone, it's about maintaining the respectful, constructive dialogue that our veterans deserve, Maya read the post twice, noting how skillfully Brittany had avoided addressing the specific accusations while positioning herself as the victim of unfair treatment. It was a masterclass in public relations damage control, designed to shift the narrative away from institutional bias and toward personal conflict between individual students. The response was immediate and divided. Students who'd witnessed the original confrontation posted their own accounts, contradicting Brittany's version of events. Others, particularly those with connections to wealthy donor families, rallied to Brittany's defense with posts about the importance of civil discourse and the dangers of social media mob mentality. Maya realized she was witnessing something that went beyond her personal situation. The campus was dividing along lines that reflected broader social tensions about privilege, accountability, and whose stories deserved to be heard. Her grandmother's military service had become a symbol in a larger cultural conflict about power and representation. Her phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed Professor Hartwell's name. "Maya, I'm calling to warn you about something," the professor said without preamble. "I've just been contacted by the university's legal counsel. They're claiming that our Veterans History Project interviews violate student privacy policies and demanding that we cease all recording activities." Maya felt a chill. Can they do that? They can try. University legal departments have broad authority over campus research activities, especially when they involve current students. But this is clearly retaliation for the media coverage, not a legitimate policy concern. Professor Hartwell paused, and Maya could hear papers rustling in the background. "There's more. I've been informed that my request to expand the project into a regional study of women Vietnam veterans has been denied due to budgetary constraints and competing academic priorities." The message was clear. The university was using its institutional power to shut down any research that might validate Maya's claims or draw further attention to the gaps in veteran recognition. It was a sophisticated form of censorship, wrapped in administrative procedure and academic policy. "Professor, what can we do?" "We document everything. We make sure this story gets told regardless of institutional pressure. And we connect with people outside the university who have the resources and authority to hold institutions accountable." Maya thought about Sandra Martinez's offer of legal representation and media coordination. "I think I know some people who might be interested in helping." 20 minutes later, Maya was walking across campus toward the student union, her mind racing with strategies and contingency plans. But as she approached the main quad, she saw something that stopped her cold. A small crowd gathered around the Veterans Memorial she'd visited earlier in the week. At the center of the crowd stood an elderly man in a wheelchair, wearing a jacket covered with military patches and campaign ribbons. He was speaking to the assembled students, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to be heard on questions of military service and veteran recognition. Maya moved closer, recognizing several faces in the crowd. David Kim was there, along with Sarah Mitchell from her history class, and several other students she'd seen at the original Veterans Day planning meeting. But there were also people she didn't recognize, older individuals who looked like they might be faculty, staff, or community members. "My name is Robert Chun," the man in the wheelchair was saying, and Maya felt her world shift as she realized what was happening. "I'm Maya Chun's grandfather, and I'm here to tell you about my wife's military service. Maya pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding as she approached the grandfather she'd thought was too frail to leave his assisted living facility. Robert Chun had been married to Patricia Rosenberg for 47 years before her death, and Maya had never heard him speak publicly about her military service. Patricia never talked about Vietnam, Robert continued, his voice steady despite his obvious physical frailty. For 50 years, she kept those stories locked away because she came home to a country that didn't want to hear them. But she saved lives over there. She held dying boys while mortar fell around the hospital. She earned the right to be remembered. The crowd was completely silent, transfixed by the quiet dignity of an elderly man defending his wife's legacy. Maya could see tears in several eyes, and she noticed that even students who'd been skeptical of her story were listening with respectful attention. "My granddaughter has been attacked for wearing Patricia's dog tags," Robert said, his eyes finding Maya in the crowd. "She's been accused of lying about our family's military service. Well, I'm here to tell you that every word she said is true, and I have the documents to prove it." From a folder in his lap, Robert pulled out a stack of papers that Maya had never seen before. Military orders, medical records, letters of commendation, and photographs that documented Patricia Rosenberg's service in ways that went far beyond the simple dog tags Maya had inherited. "These are Patricia's official records released by the Department of Veterans Affairs just yesterday," Robert announced. "They confirm her service at the 85th Evacuation Hospital outside Da Nang from March 1969 to April 1970. They document her exposure to Agent Orange and her qualification for disability benefits she never claimed. They prove that my wife was exactly the hero my granddaughter said she was." Maya stared at her grandfather in amazement. She'd had no idea that he'd been working behind the scenes to obtain official documentation of Patricia's service, or that he'd been following the campus controversy closely enough to intervene at this crucial moment. "But more importantly," Robert continued, "these records prove that there are probably hundreds of other women veterans whose service has been forgotten or denied. My granddaughter has opened a door that needed to be opened, and I'm proud of her for refusing to let people close it." The crowd began to disperse slowly, with many people approaching Robert to thank him for sharing his wife's story. Maya waited until most of the students had left before approaching her grandfather's wheelchair. "Grandpa, how did you get here? How did you get those records?" Robert smiled, and for a moment, Maya could see the young man who'd fallen in love with a determined Army nurse more than 50 years ago. "Your professor friend contacted me yesterday, told me what was happening, and asked if I had any additional documentation. Turns out Patricia saved more than I realized." He handed Maya the folder containing her grandmother's official service records. "She made me promise never to show these to anyone while she was alive. She was afraid of the questions, the attention, the possibility that people would try to turn her service into something it wasn't. But now things are different," Maya finished. "Now her granddaughter has made sure the truth gets told properly," Robert agreed. "Patricia would be proud of what you've done this week. Scared, probably, but proud." As Maya helped her grandfather back to his transportation, she realized that the crisis had evolved into something none of them had anticipated. What had started as a personal confrontation about family respect had become a public reckoning with institutional accountability and veteran recognition. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since this started, Maya felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The revelation that Maya's grandfather had official documentation of Patricia Rosenberg's service changed everything overnight. By Sunday evening, the story had been picked up by national news networks, military advocacy organizations, and congressional representatives who specialized in veteran affairs. Maya found herself at the center of a media storm that extended far beyond Riverside University's carefully manicured campus. The breakthrough came when Congressman Michael Torres, chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs, issued a statement calling for a comprehensive review of how universities handled veteran recognition and family military history. Torres had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before entering politics, and his involvement gave the story a level of political legitimacy that transformed it. From campus controversy to national policy discussion, Maya was studying in her dorm room when Professor Hartwell called with news that would change the trajectory of her entire college experience. "Maya, I've just received a call from the Library of Congress Veterans History Project," Professor Hartwell said, her voice carrying barely contained excitement. "They want to fast-track your grandmother's documentation and use it as the foundation for a national initiative to identify overlooked women veterans from the Vietnam era." Maya set down her textbook, trying to process the implications of what her professor was saying. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means Patricia Rosenberg's story is going to reach millions of people," Professor Hartwell explained. The Veterans History Project has partnerships with major media outlets, educational institutions, and government agencies. They're proposing a documentary series about forgotten women veterans, starting with your grandmother's service record. The irony wasn't lost on Maya that her grandmother, who'd spent 50 years hiding her military service, was about to become the face of a national campaign for veteran recognition. But more than irony, Maya felt the weight of responsibility that came with being the keeper of such an important story. "There's something else," Professor Hartwell continued. "The Department of Veterans Affairs has launched an investigation into records management practices for women veterans from the Vietnam era. Preliminary research suggests that thousands of women who served in combat support roles never received proper recognition or benefits." Maya thought about her grandmother's respiratory problems, her skin conditions, her decades of health issues that the family had attributed to aging rather than military service. Patricia Rosenberg had been one person among thousands who'd served their country and then been forgotten by the systems designed to support them. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. Maya had learned to answer these calls carefully, as they could be anything from legitimate journalists to hostile critics who'd gotten her personal information from social media. "Miss Chun? This is Major Sarah Washington with the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Women's Health. I'm calling about your grandmother's service record and a related matter that requires immediate attention." Maya put Professor Hartwell on hold and switched to the new call. "What kind of matter?" "We've reviewed Patricia Rosenberg's medical records and service documentation," Major Washington explained. "Based on her documented exposure to Agent Orange and her service location, she would have qualified for disability compensation and medical benefits worth approximately $180,000 over the past 3 decades. The number hit Maya like a physical blow. Her grandmother had lived modestly, working part-time jobs well into her 70s, and struggling with medical expenses that might have been covered by VA benefits she'd never known she could claim. Furthermore, Major Washington continued, the VA is prepared to issue a posthumous Purple Heart to Patricia Rosenberg for injuries sustained during mortar attacks on her medical facility. Her service records indicate she was wounded twice while treating patients under fire. Maya felt tears starting to form. Her grandmother had never mentioned being wounded, never spoke of Purple Heart eligibility, never indicated that her service had been anything more than routine medical work in a dangerous environment. Miss Chun, there's one more thing, Major, Washington said gently. We believe there may be other family members who are eligible for benefits based on Patricia's service. Educational benefits, medical coverage, survivor benefits that were never claimed because the family didn't know they existed. After ending the call with Major Washington, Maya sat in her dorm room staring at her grandmother's dog tags and trying to comprehend the magnitude of what was being revealed. Patricia Rosenberg hadn't just been a forgotten veteran, she'd been a decorated combat veteran, whose service had never been properly acknowledged or compensated. Maya called her grandfather at his assisted living facility. Knowing that he needed to hear this news from family rather than from government officials or media reports. "Grandpa, I just got a call from the VA about Grandma's service record." "I figured they'd be calling," Robert Chun replied, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and sadness. "Patricia made me promise never to pursue benefits or recognition while she was alive. She was afraid of the bureaucracy, afraid of having to prove herself to people who weren't there." "Did you know about the Purple Heart eligibility?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. "I suspected. She had scars that she never talked about, nightmares that lasted for decades. But she made me swear never to ask questions, never to push for details she wasn't ready to share." Maya could hear the pain in her grandfather's voice as he spoke about the woman he'd loved for nearly 50 years, the woman who'd carried the weight of unrecognized service throughout their entire marriage. "The VA wants to issue the Purple Heart posthumously," Maya said. "She'd have mixed feelings about that," Robert replied. "Proud, but also frustrated that it took this long. Patricia always said the military was quick to send people to war, but slow to take care of them when they came home." That evening, Maya received an unexpected visitor. She was leaving the library when she encountered Brittany Westfield waiting near the entrance. But this wasn't the confident, perfectly composed student leader Maya had confronted the previous week. Brittany looked exhausted, uncertain, and younger than her 21 years. "Maya, can we talk?" Brittany asked, her voice lacking its usual authority. They found a quiet bench near the student center, away from the foot traffic that might turn their conversation into public spectacle. Maya waited for Brittany to speak first, unsure what to expect from this unexpected encounter. "I owe you an apology," Brittany said finally. "Not the kind of public relations apology my father's lawyer suggested, but a real one." Maya studied Brittany's face, looking for signs of manipulation or strategic positioning. But what she saw instead was genuine discomfort and what might have been shame. "I've been reading about your grandmother's service record," Brittany continued. "The Agent Orange exposure, the mortar attacks, the Purple Heart eligibility. I had no idea." "You didn't want to know," Maya replied, not unkindly but without softening the truth. "You preferred the version of military service that looked good in photo opportunities." Brittany nodded, accepting the criticism. "You're right. I grew up thinking veterans were like the old men in parades, wearing uniforms and medals and telling stories about glory and heroism. I never thought about the people who came home and just tried to forget, who never got recognition for what they'd done." Maya felt something unexpected, sympathy for someone who'd been raised in a world where difficult truths were consistently hidden behind comfortable facades. "My family doesn't have military connections," Brittany continued. "We've never had to think about service or sacrifice beyond writing checks to veteran charities and attending Memorial Day ceremonies. When you started talking about your grandmother's story, I literally couldn't process it because it didn't fit anything I'd been taught to expect." "So you decided it must be fake," Maya said. "I decided it must be exaggerated or misunderstood," Brittany corrected. Which was wrong, but it felt safer than accepting that I'd been ignorant about something so important. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching students pass by in the evening light. Maya thought about her grandmother's stories of coming home to a country that preferred comfortable myths to difficult realities, and she recognized that Brittany's ignorance wasn't malicious, it was systematic, the result of a society that sanitized military service to make it more palatable for civilian consumption. "What happens now?" Brittany asked. "Now you have a choice," Maya replied. "You can go back to planning Veterans Day events that make everyone feel good about themselves, or you can use this experience to create something that actually honors the complexity of military service." Brittany looked at Maya with something approaching respect. What would that look like? Maya thought about her grandmother's decades of silence, about the thousands of other women veterans whose stories had been forgotten or dismissed, about the responsibility that came with finally having a platform to tell these difficult truths. It would look like consulting actual veterans about what recognition means to them, Maya said. It would look like acknowledging that some veterans came home to hostility instead of parades, that some served in roles that weren't officially recognized for decades, that some qualified for benefits they never received because the system failed them. That's a lot harder than red, white, and blue decorations and inspiring speeches, Brittany observed. Yes, it is, Maya agreed, but that's what makes it worthwhile. As they parted ways, Maya realized that her confrontation with the Veterans Day Planning Committee had achieved something she'd never expected. It had educated people who'd never been forced to think seriously about military service and veteran recognition. The easy assumptions about patriotism and support for veterans were being challenged by the reality of her grandmother's experience. Maya returned to her dorm room to find another stack of interview requests, research proposals, and messages from veteran families who'd seen their own experiences reflected in Patricia Rosenberg's story. The national conversation about overlooked military service was expanding rapidly, driven by families who'd been waiting decades for someone to take their stories seriously. Her grandmother's dog tags felt heavier than ever as Maya prepared for bed, weighted not just with personal history, but with the responsibility of representing thousands of forgotten veterans whose service deserved better recognition than they'd received. The real work was just beginning, but Maya no longer felt like she was fighting alone against institutional indifference and social ignorance. She was part of something larger now, a movement to ensure that military service was honored honestly rather than conveniently, completely rather than selectively. Patricia Rosenberg's granddaughter had found her mission, and she wasn't going to stop until every forgotten veteran story was told properly. The vindication arrived on Tuesday morning in the form of a phone call that would change everything Maya had understood about her grandmother's military service. She was walking to her constitutional law class when her phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize with a Virginia area code. "Miss Chun? This is Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Adams from the Pentagon's Personnel Recovery and Casualty Affairs Division. I'm calling about Patricia Rosenberg's service record and some information that's come to light during our review." Maya stopped walking, finding a quiet spot near the campus fountain where she could focus on what was clearly going to be an important conversation. "We've been conducting a comprehensive review of women veterans from the Vietnam era, Lieutenant," Colonel Adams continued, "and your grandmother's case has revealed some extraordinary circumstances that were never properly documented or recognized." Maya felt her pulse quicken. The past week had already brought revelations about Purple Heart eligibility and significant financial benefits her grandmother had never claimed. She couldn't imagine what additional information the Pentagon might have discovered. "Miss Chun, according to classified records that were recently declassified as part of our review, Patricia Rosenberg didn't just serve as a combat nurse at the 85th Evacuation Hospital. She was part of a classified medical unit that treated wounded soldiers in forward operating areas that were officially considered too dangerous for medical personnel." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. Her grandmother had downplayed her service as routine medical work behind the lines, but the Pentagon was describing something much more dangerous and significant. "What does that mean exactly?" Maya asked, her voice barely steady. "It means your grandmother was essentially a combat medic who operated in areas where traditional medical evacuation wasn't possible," Lieutenant Colonel Adams explained. "She volunteered for missions that took her into active combat zones to treat wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved to regular medical facilities." Maya thought about her grandmother's nightmares, her decades of silence about her military service, her insistence that the experiences were too difficult to discuss. Suddenly those reactions made perfect sense. Patricia Rosenberg hadn't just witnessed combat. She'd participated in it at a level that had been kept secret for over 50 years. Furthermore, Lieutenant Colonel Adams continued, Patricia Rosenberg is credited with saving 43 lives during her deployment, including several missions where she remained with wounded soldiers under direct enemy fire until evacuation became possible. Maya had to sit down on a nearby bench as the magnitude of her grandmother's service became clear. Patricia Rosenberg hadn't just been a forgotten veteran, she'd been a genuine hero whose actions had been classified to protect operational security and the safety of other personnel conducting similar missions. Ms. Chun, the Pentagon is prepared to posthumously award Patricia Rosenberg the Bronze Star Medal with Valor device for her actions during a particularly dangerous mission in April 1970. She remained with 3 critically wounded soldiers during a 6-hour firefight, providing medical care that kept them alive until a rescue operation could reach their position. Maya was crying now, overwhelmed by the recognition that was finally coming for her grandmother's service. Patricia Rosenberg had carried the weight of classified military service for 50 years, unable to share the full story of what she'd done because it had been deemed too sensitive for public knowledge. "There's one more thing," Lieutenant Colonel Adams said gently. "Your grandmother's personnel file contains a letter she wrote requesting that her service record remain classified permanently. She specifically asked that her family never be contacted about her military service unless they initiated the inquiry themselves." Maya understood immediately why her grandmother had made such a request. Patricia Rosenberg had wanted to protect her family from the weight of knowing exactly how dangerous her service had been, how close she'd come to not coming home at all. "Miss Chun, given the recent media attention and the importance of recognizing women veterans who've been overlooked, the Pentagon would like to formally honor Patricia Rosenberg at a ceremony in Washington. We'd also like your permission to include her story in a documentary about classified military service by women during the Vietnam era." After ending the call with Lieutenant Colonel Adams, Maya sat by the fountain trying to process the magnitude of what she'd learned. Her confrontation with the Veterans Day Planning Committee had started a chain of events that was revealing the true scope of her grandmother's heroism, service that had been hidden not because it was unimportant, but because it was too important. For public disclosure, she called Professor Hartwell immediately, knowing that the implications of this revelation extended far beyond her family's personal story. "Maya, this is extraordinary," Professor Hartwell said after Maya shared the details of her conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Adams. "Your grandmother was essentially a special operations medic before that designation officially existed for women. This is going to revolutionize how we understand women's roles in Vietnam-era combat operations." Maya thought about Brittany Westfield's dismissive comments about costume jewelry and fake dog tags. The irony was almost overwhelming. The student committee had mocked what they assumed was a minor family military connection. But Patricia Rosenberg's actual service record surpassed anything they could have imagined. "Professor, what does this mean for the Veterans History Project?" "It means we're documenting one of the most significant untold stories of the Vietnam War," Professor Hartwell replied. "And it means your grandmother's service is going to be studied and honored at the highest levels of government and academia." That afternoon, Maya received an unexpected visit from Dean Robertson, who appeared at her dorm room looking significantly less confident than he had during their previous meeting. The dean's expression suggested he'd realized that attempting to silence Maya had been a serious miscalculation. "Miss Chen, I wanted to speak with you privately about recent developments," Dean Robertson said, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation he was about to have. Maya invited him into the common area of her dormitory, curious about what had prompted this personal visit from the university's administration. "I've been contacted by several congressional offices, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Pentagon regarding your grandmother's service record," Dean Robertson began. It appears that Riverside University is now associated with one of the most significant military recognition stories of the year. Maya could hear the calculation in the dean's voice as he recognized that the university's attempt to suppress her story had backfired spectacularly. Instead of protecting donor relationships, the administration had found itself on the wrong side of a national conversation about veteran recognition and institutional accountability. The university would like to formally apologize for any suggestion that your family's military service was anything less than authentic and honorable, Dean Robertson continued. We're also prepared to establish a scholarship program in Patricia Rosenberg's name for descendants of women veterans. Maya studied the dean's face, recognizing that this apology was motivated more by public relations concerns than genuine remorse. The university had discovered that opposing her story carried greater reputational risks than supporting it. What about the Veterans Day Planning Committee? Maya asked. Miss Westfield has requested a meeting with you to discuss restructuring the commemoration event, Dean Robertson replied. She's expressed interest in consulting with actual veterans and military families about appropriate recognition activities. Maya nodded, unsurprised that Brittany had recognized the need to change course. The revelation of Patricia Rosenberg's classified service record had made it impossible to continue defending the committee's original approach. Dean Robertson, I appreciate the university's willingness to acknowledge the situation, Maya said carefully. But I want to make sure that any recognition of my grandmother's service is done properly, not just as a way to repair the university's public image. Of course, the dean agreed quickly. We want to ensure that Patricia Rosenberg receives the recognition she deserves. After Dean Robertson left, Maya called her grandfather to share the news about the Pentagon's findings and the Bronze Star recommendation. Robert Chun listened in silence as Maya described the classified nature of Patricia's service and the significance of her combat medical missions. She never told me the details, Robert said finally, his voice thick with emotion. But she used to wake up screaming about soldiers who were dying and couldn't be moved. Now I understand why those nightmares lasted for 50 years. Maya could hear her grandfather crying softly, grieving for the woman who'd carried such an enormous burden in silence for their entire marriage. Grandpa, the Pentagon wants to hold a formal ceremony in Washington to present the Bronze Star. Will you be able to attend? I'll be there if I have to crawl, Robert replied with determination. Patricia earned that recognition 50 years ago. It's about time she received it. That evening, Maya sat in her dorm room reading news coverage of her grandmother's story, which had evolved from a campus controversy into a national symbol of overlooked military heroism. Editorial writers were using Patricia Rosenberg's case to discuss broader questions about veteran recognition, the classification of women's military service, and the responsibility of institutions to support military families. Maya thought about her grandmother's final words about not letting them make it pretty, about ensuring that difficult truths weren't sanitized for public consumption. Patricia Rosenberg's story was being told honestly now, with all its complexity and pain and heroism intact. The dog tags around Maya's neck felt different now, weighted not just with personal history, but with national significance. Her grandmother's classified service was being declassified and honored. Her sacrifices were being recognized at the highest levels of government, and her story was inspiring other families to research their own overlooked military histories. Had started the week as a scholarship student defending her family's authenticity against privileged classmates who thought they understood military service. She was ending it as the granddaughter of a classified military hero whose story was changing how the nation understood women's roles in combat operations. The vindication was complete, but Maya understood that it came with new responsibilities. Patricia Rosenberg's legacy was now part of the historical record, and Maya had become the keeper of a story that represented thousands of other forgotten veterans whose service deserved similar recognition. Tomorrow, she would begin working with the Pentagon the Veterans History Project, and military advocacy organizations to ensure that her grandmother's story was told properly and used to honor other overlooked military families. The battle for recognition was over, but the mission to honor forgotten veterans was just beginning. 6 months later, Maya stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, watching as President Harrison prepared to posthumously award the Bronze Star Medal with Valor device to her grandmother, Patricia Rosenberg. The ceremony had drawn representatives from every major veteran organization in the country, along with dozens of military families whose own stories had been uncovered in the wake of Maya's initial confrontation at Riverside University. The journey from campus controversy to presidential recognition had transformed not just Maya's life, but the entire national conversation about overlooked military service. The Pentagon's investigation into women veterans from the Vietnam era had identified over 3,000 cases of inadequate documentation, resulting in millions of dollars in previously unclaimed benefits and hundreds of posthumous military decorations. Maya's grandfather sat in his wheelchair beside her, wearing his best suit and holding a folded American flag that would accompany Patricia's Bronze Star. Robert Chun had lived to see his wife's service finally recognized at the highest levels of government, validation that had come 53 years after Patricia first deployed to Vietnam. "Ladies and gentlemen," President Harrison began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "we gather today to honor the memory of Staff Sergeant Patricia Rosenberg, whose classified service as a combat medic exemplified the highest traditions of military heroism and selfless sacrifice." Maya closed her eyes, remembering her grandmother's voice during those final months, the fragments of stories that had seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. Now those stories were being honored by the President of the United States, transformed from family whispers into national recognition. Staff Sergeant Rosenberg volunteered for missions that took her into active combat zones, providing medical care to wounded soldiers under conditions of extreme danger, the President continued. On April 15, 1970, she remained with 3 critically wounded soldiers during a 6-hour firefight, her medical intervention preventing their deaths until rescue operations could reach their position. The citation went on to detail specific actions that had been classified for over 5 decades, heroic moments that Patricia had carried in silence, because operational security had been more important than personal recognition. Maya thought about all the nights her grandmother had awakened screaming, reliving experiences she could never share with the people who loved her most. The Bronze Star Medal with Valor device is awarded posthumously to Staff Sergeant Patricia Rosenberg for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy, President Harrison concluded, presenting the medal to Robert Chun with the dignity befitting a national hero. After the ceremony, Maya found herself surrounded by other military families who'd discovered their own overlooked stories through the Veterans History Project that had grown out of her grandmother's case. Maria Santos approached with her elderly father, whose Purple Heart eligibility had been uncovered during the Pentagon's expanded review of Vietnam-era records. "Your grandmother opened the door for all of us," Maria said, embracing Maya with tears in her eyes. "My father spent 40 years thinking his service didn't matter, because nobody ever told him about the medals he'd earned." Similar conversations continued throughout the reception, with family after family sharing stories of discovered recognition, claimed benefits, and restored dignity. Maya realized that her confrontation with Brittany Westfield and the Veterans Day Planning Committee had catalyzed something far more significant than anyone could have anticipated. Professor Hartwell approached with Dr. Michael Thompson, the director of the Veterans History Project, who'd become one of Maya's closest collaborators over the past 6 months. "Maya, we have news about the documentary series," Dr. Thompson said, his excitement evident. "The Smithsonian wants to create a permanent exhibit about classified women's military service, with your grandmother's story as the centerpiece." Maya nodded, still processing the magnitude of how far Patricia Rosenberg's story had traveled. Her grandmother's dog tags, once dismissed as fake costume jewelry, would soon be displayed in the nation's most prestigious museum as artifacts of genuine military heroism. There's something else, Professor Hartwell added. Riverside University has requested permission to rename their Veterans Memorial as the Patricia Rosenberg Memorial Garden. They want to make it a national center for research into overlooked military service. The irony wasn't lost on Maya that the university, which had tried to silence her story, was now seeking to claim it as part of their institutional legacy. But she also recognized that institutional support, however belated, would help ensure that other families received the recognition they deserved. Later that evening, Maya attended a private dinner hosted by the American Veterans Foundation, where she was presented with their annual Advocate of the Year award for her role in exposing institutional gaps in veteran recognition. Sandra Martinez, who'd first contacted Maya during the campus controversy, introduced her to an audience that included military leaders, congressional representatives, and veteran advocates from across the country. 6 months ago, Maya Chun was a college student defending her family's authenticity against classmates who thought they understood military service. Sandra said, "Today, she's the catalyst for the most significant expansion of veteran recognition in decades." Maya took the podium, looking out at faces that represented the military community she'd inadvertently joined through her grandmother's legacy. She thought about Patricia Rosenberg, 19 years old and determined to serve despite a system that didn't want women in combat roles. "My grandmother spent 50 years hiding her military service because she came home to a country that wasn't ready to acknowledge what she'd done," Maya began. "She carried the weight of classified heroism in silence because she believed her story didn't matter as much as protecting the people she loved." Maya paused, touching the dog tag she still wore beneath her formal dress. "But every story matters. Every act of service deserves recognition. Every veteran who came home carrying invisible wounds earned the right to have those wounds acknowledged and treated." The applause was sustained and emotional, reflecting the cathartic nature of finally having these long-suppressed stories brought into the light. Maya continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about the responsibility that came with inherited military legacy. "The Veterans History Project has now documented over 15,000 previously overlooked military stories," Maya said. 15,000 families who discovered that their relatives qualified for benefits they never claimed, recognition they never received, medical care they never accessed. As Maya spoke, she noticed Brittany Westfield sitting near the back of the room. The former Veterans Day Planning Committee chairwoman had spent the past 6 months working with actual veterans to redesign Riverside University's commemoration events, transforming them from photo opportunities into meaningful recognition ceremonies. After the dinner, Brittany approached Maya with a humility that would have been unimaginable during their original confrontation. "Maya, I wanted to thank you," Brittany said. "Working with real veterans this year taught me things about military service that I never learned growing up in a family that wrote checks to veteran charities, but never actually listened to veteran stories." Maya nodded, recognizing that Brittany's education had been genuine. The Veterans Day event that the Reformed Planning Committee had organized that fall had featured actual veteran speakers, honest discussions about the challenges of military service, and recognition ceremonies that focused on substance rather than aesthetics. "What are you planning to do after graduation?" Maya asked. "Law school, but with a focus on veteran advocacy," Brittany replied. "I want to work on policy issues that affect military families. Turns out having money and influence is only worthwhile if you use them for something that matters." Maya smiled, remembering her grandmother's belief that people could change when they were forced to confront difficult truths. Brittany Westfield had been transformed by her exposure to authentic military stories. evolving from someone who treated veterans as props into someone who understood the complexity of military service. As the evening concluded, Maya stepped outside, onto the hotel's terrace, where the lights of Washington, D.C. spread out before her like a constellation of possibilities. She pulled out her phone and called her grandfather, who'd returned to his assisted living facility after the White House ceremony. "Grandpa, how are you feeling after today?" "Proud," Robert replied simply. "Proud of Patricia, proud of you, proud that her story finally got told the way it deserved to be told." Maya looked up at the stars, thinking about her grandmother's journey. From classified combat medic to posthumous national hero, Patricia Rosenberg's story had required 53 years and a granddaughter's stubborn determination to reach its proper conclusion. But it had finally been told honestly and completely. "Grandpa, what do you think Grandma would say about all this attention?" Robert was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "She'd probably be embarrassed by the fuss," he said finally. "But she'd also be happy that other families don't have to wait 50 years to get the recognition they deserve." Maya nodded, understanding that her grandmother's legacy wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about creating systems and processes that would ensure future veterans received timely recognition for their service, rather than having to wait for accidental discovery decades later. The next morning, Maya returned to Riverside University for her final semester, but everything had changed. The Patricia Rosenberg Memorial Garden had become a pilgrimage site for military families, researching their own overlooked histories. The Veterans History Project had established a permanent office on campus, staffed by researchers dedicated to uncovering forgotten military stories. Maya's dorm room had been converted into a workspace, where she coordinated with veteran advocacy organizations, congressional offices, and military historians who were continuing the research that her grandmother's case had initiated. She'd changed her major from pre-law to military history, with plans to pursue graduate studies focused on women's roles in classified military operations. As Maya walked across the quad where she'd first been mocked for wearing her grandmother's dog tags, she reflected on how completely the narrative had been transformed. The students who dismissed Patricia Rosenberg's service as fake were now studying her classified missions in their military history classes. The university that had tried to silence Maya's story was now proudly claiming association with one of the most significant veteran recognition cases in decades. Maya paused at the Memorial Garden, where Patricia Rosenberg's name had been added to the central monument in bronze letters that gleamed in the morning sunlight. Below her grandmother's name was a simple inscription: Staff Sergeant Patricia Rosenberg, Army Nurse Corps, Vietnam, 1969-1970. Bronze. Star Medal with Valor. Her service was classified. Her heroism was not. Maya touched her grandmother's dog tags through her shirt, feeling the familiar weight of inherited responsibility. Patricia Rosenberg's story had been told properly, but there were thousands of other forgotten veterans whose stories still waited to be discovered and honored. The mission her grandmother had started in Vietnam, saving lives and serving with honor regardless of recognition, would continue through Maya's work to ensure that no veteran service was ever again dismissed as fake or forgotten. The dog tags that had once been mocked as costume jewelry were now recognized as artifacts of genuine American heroism. And Maya Chun had become the guardian of a legacy that would inspire military families for generations to come. 5 years later, Maya stood before a packed auditorium at the Pentagon, delivering the keynote address for the newly established Patricia Rosenberg Institute for Military Family Recognition. Behind her, a massive screen displayed the faces of over 50,000 veterans whose previously overlooked service had been documented through the program her grandmother's story had inspired. My grandmother's dog tags were called fake by people who couldn't imagine that heroism comes in forms they don't recognize, Maya said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. Today, Those same dog tags are displayed in the Smithsonian as symbols of America's commitment to honoring all military service, not just the stories that are easy to tell. In the audience, she spotted familiar faces. Professor Hartwell, now director of the National Veterans History Project; Sandra Martinez, who'd become Maya's closest collaborator in veteran advocacy; and even Brittany Westfield, now a military family rights attorney whose conversion from skeptic to advocate had become legendary in veteran circles. But the most important person here today isn't in this room, Maya continued, touching the dog tag she still wore. She's represented by every story we've uncovered, every benefit we've secured, every family that no longer has to fight for 50 years to get their loved one's service recognized. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, but Maya knew her grandmother would have been most proud of the work that happened quietly, away from cameras and ceremonies. The individual families who discovered their heritage, claimed their benefits, and found their peace. As the audience filed out, Maya whispered a promise to Patricia Rosenberg. "Your story changed everything, Grandma. Now no one will have to wait 50 years to be believed." What did you think of Maya's incredible journey from campus outcast to national advocate? Have you ever discovered hidden military history in your own family? Share your stories in the comments below. Your family's service matters too. If you were inspired by this tale of courage overcoming privilege and truth defeating prejudice, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Your support helps us bring you more incredible stories of ordinary people who refuse to let extraordinary service be forgotten. What story should we tell next? Let us know in the comments.